The fiscal close briefing will begin in 2 minutes. For our journalists joining us in the digital press room, if you'd like to ask a question, you can click the Raise Your Hand button. When your name is called on, we will unmute your microphone, and then you also will have to unmute your microphone.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being with us today. A year ago this week, I was here announcing the 2019 fiscal year end close with a $410 million surplus, trying to explain how our state revenue during the fourth quarter exceeded our best estimates by a lot. This year is quite a different story and a drastically different fourth quarter for our fiscal year in 2020. The current pandemic was unexpected, resulting in a sharp and fast decrease to state revenue during the past few months, leaving Indiana with a $900 million deficit, primarily due to the extension of the state's income tax filing deadline. Though the pandemic was unexpected, Indiana was prepared to deal with the financial ramifications it involved. This is because Indiana was prepared for the unexpected because we maintain a reasonable reserve. This year, Indiana dipped into our reserves in order to maintain essential services Hoosiers need. The state used approximately $900 million, or 38% of our $2.3 billion to close out fiscal year 2020. Our strong reserves has sustained Indiana during the initial surge of the pandemic. In light of the unexpected economic circumstances, the state is able to continue to provide the services Hoosiers need when our residents need it most. I would like to thank all state agencies and state employees for their dedication to giving great customer services under the constraints of unexpected budget cuts. Not only did we use reserves, but under the leadership of OMB and the state budget agencies, all agencies began to prioritize expenses, making sure that we only continue to give the ones that are necessary and to look at other expenses for deferral, or maybe do we need them all together. This year's deficit decreases our reserve to approximately $1.4 billion, or 9.1% of our current year expenditures. Not surprising, that percent is below our benchmark of 10 to 15%. But it is in fact responsible fiscal leadership that leaves Indiana with 9% fiscal reserve going into a new fiscal year with more economic uncertainty. We know there will be more challenges that we are going to face, especially with the pandemic and the impact it has on our residents and our economy. Governor Holcomb's team is up to the challenge. I would personally like to take this opportunity to thank the OMB Director, Chris Johnston, and the State Budget Director, Zach Jackson, for their commitment was on full display to Indiana Hoosiers as they and their team tirelessly guided the state through the new federal programs and policies, implementing a program to funnel grants to local governments, in addition to dealing with the unexpected revenue shortage. Indiana is truly blessed to have state employees dedicated to getting it done and getting it right. With that, I will turn it over to Chris Johnson to go into more detail about our fiscal year 2020 close. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Auditor Klutz. I have to reiterate, it has been a team effort, not only with the Auditor's Office, the Budget Agency, as well as all the executive branch agencies in managing through the pandemic and the fiscal impacts thus far. In advance of the meeting, we had sent to the media team 3 documents and a slide deck. And I realize that that's more that we've done in the past, but as Auditor Klutz had mentioned, these are unusual times. And so what you have received is a revenue report, a surplus statement, and a combined statement of reserves. What I'd like to do is really walk through first the revenue report. And we've also sent along some slides that accompany the numbers. And in the past, we have not usually talked about June revenues. We've really, at these forums, have really talked about what the annual recap has been. But because of the pandemic and providing monthly updates, I do want to take some time to talk about the month of June. On slide 2, we've added 2 slides that we have posted before, which are really the monthly recaps of both the estimated revenues for that particular month and the actual revenues that were collected. We've also posted or shown the difference between those 2 values. The estimated amount is what the monthly forecast would be, and it was set back in December of 2019. And as you can see for the June update, for the 4th month in a row, revenues missed forecast, and they were also lower than the same month in the prior year. Revenues in the month of June missed forecast by $250 million. Actual revenues were $1.8 billion, and we were expecting over $2 billion. The miss was about 12.4%. On slide 3 is just a graphic of those particular revenue items, the revenue categories: sales and use tax, individual income tax, corporate income tax, the wagering tax, and a collection or aggregate of miscellaneous taxes. As you can see, sales tax performed well, or just shy of forecast. If you recall, April and May, sales tax collections were off about $100 million each month. A lot of that has to do with the marketplace facilitator, which the General Assembly adopted in the last session, of which collections through those marketplace facilitators, such as third parties selling through Amazon, sales taxes are collected on those online sales. Individual income tax was off about $150 million. Corporate income tax was off $75 million. You can see, unlike the last 2 months, there was some gaming tax that was collected. This was a reflection that the casinos were open for 1 month of their, or excuse me, 1 week of their reporting period. Slide 4 are the same groupings of revenue streams, but it's for the entire year. As you can see, sales tax was off $160 million. Individual income tax was off $930 million. Corporate income tax was off $180 million, and the wagering tax was off $150 million. Slide 5 aggregates all of those, and so you can see that, as Auditor Klutz mentioned, We missed revenue by $1.4 billion, or 8.4% less than forecast, and 6% less than last year. Slide 6 is an effort to break down this revenue shortfall, the $1.4 billion, between the economic impact of the pandemic and the tax deferral. As we've mentioned several times, Indiana's income taxes were linked to the federal government, and so when they deferred the tax due date from April 15th to July 15th, Indiana followed suit. And so, as I mentioned, the individual and corporate income tax were off substantial amounts, but a significant portion of that was due to this tax deferral. Slide 6 shows that a little over $800 million was due to that tax deferral. The remaining $600 million is an effort, it's not exact, but it's an effort to capture the economic impact from the pandemic. $443 million reflects lower than expected collections from sales tax, from withholdings, and other revenue sources. The $145 million is the shortage from expected gaming tax collections, and this is really affected by the closures as they were shut down for more than 2 months. This sets up a challenge going forward in the next fiscal year, this tax deferral, as we are currently collecting July revenues. And so a lot of those taxes that were due in April are showing up in July. And so I don't want everyone to get overly confident when you see the July revenues numbers compared to what the estimate is, because a lot of that collection is from that deferral. The next document I'd like to go through is the surplus statement. At the top it says General Fund Combined Statement of Estimated I've got the wrong document. It says General Fund Surplus Statement. And you've seen this document before. It shows the beginning balance, current year revenues, current year expenses to come to the annual surplus or deficit, and then what we call below the line are many one-time actions and measures that are reflected in the current or the fiscal year just closed, but are just exactly that, one-time transactions. So as you can see, we started the year at 2.2, or just shy of $2.3 billion. The actual revenue collected was $15.4 billion. That reflects the $1.4 billion shortfall. Current year expenses, we show that $16.9 billion. Those are the appropriations, actual appropriations adopted in the last budget. The other significant item under current year expenses are reversions. You can see that we've shown a $373 million of reversions. That's a combination of several things. As we had mentioned before, when the pandemic first started hitting, the budget agency put out instructions to ask the agencies to look for additional savings. A standard practice in the state of Indiana, when you start every fiscal year, is to set a target of reserves, if you will. Do not spend as much as you've been appropriated. And that has traditionally been around 3%. Last year it was 2%. And so in the month of March, the state budget agency sent out a communication to state agencies and asked them to do as best as they could, better or greater than that 2% target. There wasn't an exact percentage set because here we were already 3/4 of the way through the fiscal year. And so it was sort of a best efforts initiative. But of that 373, the largest component of that is enhanced federal matching for Medicaid. That's about $250 million. This is a practice that has been initiated by the federal government in recessionary times. It was done in 2003 and it was done in 2009. Medicaid is a matching program between state governments and the federal government. And during these times, the federal government has enhanced their percentage of the matching, providing fiscal relief to states, as well as ensuring that services that have been committed to are delivered for Medicaid clients. The other significant component of the 373 is, I think, about $35 or $36 million of tuition support. We've talked a lot about tuition support. This is not a reserve on tuition support, but it is a result of applying our funding formula where the money follows the child. And so this is a reflection of the actual average daily membership or attendance at our schools throughout the year. Again, as Auditor Klutz mentioned, you take the current year revenues less the current year expenses, and we have an $882 million annual deficit. The below the line items help offset that. You can see I'll talk about a couple of these items. One of them is a judgment payment. There's been a lawsuit through FSSA and IBM, and so that was finally resolved, and that $73 million was booked to the general fund. We had talked before last year when, again, times were different and we had available cash and we contemplated cash funding university projects instead of bonding for them. You'll see an entry that basically offsets that we will now consider bonding those projects. And then finally, there is a transfer from one of our reserve funds, and I'm going to ask Zach Jackson to come up in a little bit to talk about the interaction of our reserve funds. It's not just one bucket of reserves. We have several reserves, and I'm going to ask him to talk about the interaction of that. But we did make a transfer out of the Medicaid reserve into the general fund. As you can see, we ended the year at the $1.4 billion, and it is just a coincidence that we were short by $1.4 billion, and our ending balance in the reserves is $1.4 billion. Not connected. I mean, they are distinct numbers. One other thing I want to point out about this surplus statement. So fiscal year 20 are the actual numbers, how we close the books. You'll see the footnote up in the very first line about the forecasted revenue, and it's really speaking to fiscal year 2021. That column, which talks about revenues and expenditures, has not been revised since the revenue forecast in December of 2019. Indiana has developed over many years and maintains a respected revenue forecasting process and protocol, a consensus forecast. Not all states do that. And out of respect for that process and to avoid undue speculation of one party actually forecasting where revenues are going to be for fiscal year 21 and all the resulting actions that may be needed to address that, we have left that column alone. So it has not changed since the fiscal year, or excuse me, since the forecast in December of 2019. We still have to recognize, though, that the revenue forecast is probably not realistic, and that is why the budget agency and the fiscal leadership in the General Assembly has asked for a revised revenue forecast to be delivered in September. A revised surplus statement will be issued following that revenue forecast that provides greater details about the actions needed ahead in order to address the outcome of that revenue forecast. Finally, I would like to talk about slides 7 and 8, which have been put in your packet as more of a historical perspective. Slide 7 shows the historical expenditures in 3 fashions. What are the appropriations that the General Assembly has adopted? What are the reversions, basically spending less money that have been needed? And then what is that net spending? and simply showing that in times of stress, if you look back to 2009 through 2012, that even though the General Assembly adopted a reduced budget with less appropriations, reversions and reduced spending were needed even on top of that in order to maintain services. As you can see from 2009 through 2011, the net spending level virtually did not change in any of those years. Finally, slide 8 shows those historical reserves, the combined reserves. And so you can see the result of some of the recessionary periods in the early 2000s, the results from 2010 through 2012, and then where we are right now in 2020. We will most likely need more austere budgets. We'll most likely need greater reversions to manage the uncertainties ahead. The governor has asked, and the budget agency has put out instructions to look at additional spending in order for us to not only meet and deliver sound services to our citizens, but then the ultimate outcome after that is to restore the reserves that we were built up and we were fortunate enough to be able to use during this pandemic and moving forward. I did mention the $1.4 billion is an aggregate of several reserve funds that have been set up, I would say judiciously so, by the executive branch and the legislature over many years. And there is an interaction between those reserve funds. And as I mentioned, I'd like Zach Jackson to come up and sort of explain that relationship between the reserve funds, and he'll walk through a little bit more of the final document, which is the combined statement of estimated unappropriated reserves.
Thanks, Chris, and let me start by thanking the staff at the budget agency as well as colleagues at other state agencies for helping us get through this year. As Chris mentioned, I'll be speaking to what's labeled as the general fund surplus statement, as well as the next document in the packet, the general fund combined statement of estimated unappropriated reserve. As has been noted, we started off the fiscal year 20 with approximately $2.27 billion in the general fund combined balances. I like to separate these into maybe 4 different buckets. I often refer to the general fund itself as our checking account, and then the 3 other reserve funds as our savings accounts. And those 3 savings accounts are the rainy day fund, the Medicaid reserve fund, as well as the tuition reserve fund. When we started the year at 2.27 and then ended at approximately 1.4 billion, it was an impact on at least 2 of those funds. And so turning to that second page, the combined statement, on that you can see that the general fund itself, the checking account, if you will, started off with $834 million. And in the document, about 2/3 of the way down, you can see that we ended the year with approximately $542 million. The reason that we have $542 million is that we transferred the entire balance of the Medicaid contingency and reserve fund to the general fund. Had we not done so, the general fund would have been negative at the end of the year, and we would have had to start talking about making lower payments in some instances, likely to programs like Medicaid, things like that. And so as part of the closeout procedures, we did go ahead and transfer that balance of the Medicaid reserve fund to the general fund. That brings the Medicaid reserve fund balance to 0. We're finishing the year with a state tuition reserve balance of $348 million, and the rainy day fund with a balance of about $529 million. When we're thinking about how we use those reserve funds for the benefit of the general fund, there are certain options and certain triggers, if you will. When it comes to the rainy day fund, statute dictates when we transfer money in the rainy day fund from the general fund or vice versa, whenever we send money the other way. Because of the way that this pandemic and our financial reaction here occurred, it occurred so quickly in the year and so late in the year, it did not actually trigger a transfer out of our rainy day fund to the general fund. And consequently, there was no transfer in the other direction as well. Basically, getting to the end of the year, the only way we could have tapped into that balance would be knowing well enough in advance how much we would have needed and to ask the budget committee to review that transfer. And that's just not something we knew about with enough time, how much we would need to replenish the general fund. Similar situation with the state tuition reserve fund. That could have been something that we moved to the general fund, but again, that requires review by the budget committee and just didn't know exactly how much we would need at closeout to make that happen. We're left with the Medicaid contingency reserve being the tool that, as budget director, I had left to make sure that the general fund did not run out of cash. And transferring the entire balance not only makes sure that the general fund does not close negative, but also gives us a good starting balance for fiscal year 21 to ensure that we continue to make timely payments on Medicaid as well as other services. We're fortunate to have those significant balances already in place so that we did not really have to put in any more cuts in fiscal 20 to keep the general fund balance. With that, I'll turn it back over to Chris for some closing remarks.
Thank you. As you can tell, as the auditor mentioned, we had an interesting close last year, the last 3 months. But obviously, it's been just the opposite as far as the direction of which our revenues have gone for these 3 months. But we're up to the challenge. Again, as I said, it is a team effort between the auditor's office, budget agency, and the executive branch agencies. And we'll get a new revenue forecast in September and prepare for the next budget, which that revenue forecast will be updated in December as well. There's a lot more detail that will be posted or has been posted to the state budget agency website. I think there's a series of 5 or 6 additional reports that you can access for additional information. With that, I'll turn it over to Rachel to open up the mic for questions.
We'll begin with Nikki Kelly with the Fort Wayne Journal-Gazette.
Hi, I was trying to understand on the surplus statement why you have only $25 million scheduled for reversions for next year when you have a 15% agency target to cut. So why are we not being more clear about what we're going to cut there?
Right. It goes back, Nikki, to and this was we debated this because if you don't have a balanced approach of adjusting the revenues and the reversions, if we put in a significant target of reversions, then that estimated balance already there for fiscal year 21 probably provides a too optimistic of a look at where we might end up in fiscal year 21. So that's why we just adhered to sort of respecting the fiscal year 21. But when we do the updated forecast in September, we'll have to look at both sides, both the revenue and the spending cuts.
Okay, next we have Brandon Smith, Indiana Public Broadcasting.
Hey, Chris.
Hey, Brendan.
My question was about the $827.8 million that you're estimating that we didn't get in fiscal year 2020 because of the tax deferral.
Right.
Are you anticipating getting all of that in fiscal year 21, or how much of that might you get, and how much is that going to help sort of settle the books a little bit as we go into this next fiscal year?
Well, I think I would be foolish to speculate that we're going to get 100% collections, to be honest with you. And so, but it is something, obviously tax day was yesterday. In 2020, tax day was yesterday. And so it is something that the Department of Revenue, the Auditor's Office, and ourselves will be looking at over the next couple of weeks. We are certainly hoping for the best, but to say that we would collect all $800 or $827 million, I think would be, I'm just not prepared to go there. We're going to take those results, though, and then that'll factor in. And that's one of the reasons why we're doing the revenue forecast a little bit update. We were thinking about doing it sooner, but the technical committee was saying you really need that data from those collections because that's going to make an inference about the economic impact. And so it obviously is going to help from a cash flow perspective, but if you look at the other components, the gaming tax and the other sales tax and withholdings that are off by about $400 million, that doesn't make me feel real positive either. And I think we have to track those as far as what that impact is on our revenues and our fiscal status.
Tom Davies, The Associated Press.
Hi, Chris. How are you going to be able to incorporate the federal funding in the from the CARES Act in the budget for expenses already made in 2020 and going forward?
Right. And so that's a good point, Tom, is we have not moved a lot of that money. So, and I know you've been on some of the calls, there is a fund that comes to the state called the Coronavirus Relief Fund. And there are, even though it does not allow for us to backfill the 1.4 million that we've lost out on, it does allow for us to cover certain expenses, including payroll, PPE that we've purchased out of our other state funds in state agencies, and recover other costs that state agencies have incurred because of the pandemic. We have, again, not moved a dramatic amount. We've done some, but not in a substantial way, those reimbursements. One, because the guidance continues to change coming out of the federal government, and we didn't want to make some assumptions about making a transfer before the fiscal year end and then getting updated guidance that then we might have to either reverse that entry or do something differently. But it is something that we will be doing before the expiration of that fund, which right now is December 30th. And as you've been reading, I'm sure, Congress is deliberating if there's going to be additional relief assistance provided, as well as I'm hearing, possibly freeing up some of the restrictions on the relief fund to accommodate some of the things that you had mentioned.
Lindsay Erdody, The Indianapolis Business Journal. Lindsay, you should be able to speak. We'll come back to Lindsay. Tom Davies of the Associated Press. Oh, Tom lowered his hand. Do we have any other questions from reporters on the line? You can raise your hand if you'd like to ask an additional question. Brandon Smith, Indiana Public Broadcasting.
Hey, Chris.
Hey.
I'm going through the reversions, the reversion details, and I had a couple questions about some of the big ticket items. The biggest one one of the biggest ones that I can see, apart from that Medicaid part that we got from the feds that you already talked, or that Zach talked about, was 36 million turf to the school tuition fund in the Department of Ed.
Correct.
Can you talk about what was that exact? How did we get that money? What was that?
Well, I think I'll turn it over to Zach, who knows a little more of the individual details. But it's really driven off of the tuition support formula by school corporation, and is really driven by the attendance, the ADM that has taken over the course of the school year. But I'll ask Zach to elaborate.
Thanks, and that's exactly right. The tuition support formula and the tuition support appropriation makes up nearly half of our state budget. And, we get very close to spending as a percentage that entire appropriation every year. But the formula is calculated, probably almost a year in advance of the end of the fiscal year. And we hardly ever, nail that to the dollar. If you look back at our past reversion year reports, you would see that we have typically had reversions in the several $1,000,000 range. And this reversion of, I think, approximately 37 million is not abnormal by any means. You'll see similar numbers to that in the past few fiscal years. I'll just note, too, that was not in any way our office or the Department of Education intending to hold a reserve or anything like that. It was just that the formula itself did not distribute all of the dollars there.
Lindsay Doty, the Indianapolis Business Journal.
All right, can you guys hear me now?
Yep.
Okay,
Yes.
we're good. Sorry about that.
No problem.
So on the June revenues, I'm curious, the other taxes that were higher, do you know where that's coming from and why that was higher than estimated?
Well, I know a big chunk of that is the excise tax and vehicle registration is just booked in the month of June. And so if you look at the other miscellaneous taxes in previous months, it's a much lower amount. And so I think that's where the step up in that amount is. Usually in each month, it's not that $400 million range, but we could get more detail behind some of the other items that are in there. But that is just really an aggregation of a lot of miscellaneous taxes.
Tom Davies, the Associated Press.
Looking at the June revenue figures that you have here, make sure I'm looking at the right one. Still showing individual income tax down. Is that mainly from withholding what you get collected from tax withholdings? And is that a concern with high unemployment and such? And then after you ask that, I have a follow-up as well.
Okay. Actually, Tom, I think it's a combination of a couple of things. This might go back to a question that Brandon asked about, well, if we collect everything that was due in April in July, do we feel better about it? I think it's what we see in June is not only some of the impact from withholdings, but June is also an estimated payment month for both corporations and individuals for the coming tax year. And so either they're taking advantage of the deferral, or they could be saying, I might have a lower tax liability, and so I'm not going to make as high an estimated tax. So I don't have a specific answer for you. It could be a combination of all of those things. And what's your follow-up question? Yeah.
My other question has to do with what expenses do you know have gone up related to the pandemic response, and are those reflected in how are those reflected in this report?
Well, we've again spent a lot on personal protective equipment. We've spent a fair amount on getting the testing up and running and contact tracing, and those have not, some of those expenses have received grants specifically for those purposes, and then there's others where we've moved that money out of the coronavirus relief fund to cover those expenses, and so they're not really reflected yet in the general fund. I shouldn't say yet, they're just not reflected in the general fund. Now, some of the expenses that I mentioned about payroll reimbursement, there are eligible expenses for sick leave and paid family medical leave, as well as devoting our payroll resources, personnel and staffing costs to these efforts that we can reimburse, and we have not done that up and down all the agencies yet. So to a big extent, it's not happened yet, but we will be doing that later. Yep. Auditor Klutz, Tom will add to that. Hold on.
I just wanted to follow up on what Chris was talking about. Early on, they had all the agencies try to code all their expenses that they thought might be eligible for the federal grant funding or just COVID-related with a special code. And we have tagged that, and we have a special page on the Indiana Transparency Portal just for the COVID expenses by agency and by type. So you're welcome to go out there and see how much we've spent on PPE and other expenses, as we are still trying to figure out exactly what we are allowed to get reimbursed for. We have tried to code all of our expenses, including payroll, to that code so that everybody and anybody can see and ask questions while we're trying to work through that. Thank you.
Brandon Smith, Indiana Public Broadcasting.
Hey, this is for Chris or maybe Zach again. I'm back on the reversions
Okay.
details. Obviously, FSSA has the biggest amount of reversions, though the biggest chunk of that is, again, that Medicaid help from the federal government in terms of the match. But you're still looking at $18 million aside from that, reverted from that agency, which is a lot of agencies. Are there services that were cut?
I'll let Zach speak to that. I don't think that the reversion outside of the FMAP Medicaid that you referred to, I don't recall that this number is dramatically different than reversions that the FSSA has provided in the past. But I don't know those numbers as well as Zach does or his staff does. So. Hold on.
Hey, Brandon. I'll draw your attention to the, and you're probably looking at the general fund reversions by agencies report. The number that you mentioned, the 18 million, you can see where how that lines up in terms of as a percentage of their overall spend. And it's not a substantial percentage of their overall spend. I was trying to find in my document here. I believe it's approximately 2.7% of their overall spend. And so, when we started off agencies, asking agencies for 2% and then asked them what more could they do, whenever we sent out a memo in March, they were able to grow their reversions by about 0.7%. There's also a document that kind of goes through line by line of their appropriations, and you can see where they have reverted dollars from. To the best of my knowledge, I'm not aware that we've reduced any service levels or anything along those lines. I think often agencies will hold positions that become vacant, will hold them vacant to achieve these targets and attempt to renegotiate existing contracts, things like that. But I'm not aware of any service reductions that FSSA implemented in order to hit those targets. And I'll just also add, Brandon, that reversion amount is fairly in line with FSSA's historical reversions. I think last year, I think we were approximately 16 million in terms of what they reverted last year. So this is fairly in line with how they usually perform.
Nikki Kelly, the Fort Wayne Journal-Gazette.
Can one of you talk about how the Department of Child Services finished up the year, how much you had to augment their budget? And I assume they didn't revert anything.
Hi, Nikki. Yeah, you're exactly right. The Department of Child Services did not revert any dollars at the end of fiscal year 20. In fact, and I think you were at the Budget Committee meeting on June 17th, there I mentioned that we were expecting to need to augment their general fund budget by at least $20 million. That number rose to $33.9 million by the end of the fiscal year. I think what we were encountering there is some differences in their federal funds compared to what they expected whenever their budget was first passed. As they shifted from a waiver type block grant with their federal funds, that was one it was more money, but also less restrictive in how they use that money into a more traditional grant program for a lot of their federally reimbursable services. That they ended up getting less federal dollars than they expected, as well as the flexibility of those federal dollars was less than they expected. So they had certain expenses that they weren't allowed to apply to those federal grants, and that's what required us to augment their budget by that $34 million for fiscal year 20.
Lindsay Doty, the IBJ.
I know you guys have asked the state agencies to cut the 15% for 2021, and I'm just curious if someone could talk about how that process is going. I mean, have the agencies all been able to identify 15% that they're going to cut? Are some agencies going to cut more than that, or some going to cut less? Just an update on that.
Yeah, we with the guidance that the budget agency sent out a couple months ago, we were asked every agency to send us a strategic plan in late June to look at their spending for FY21. As you noted, we did ask for 15%. I think we've heard from every agency that reports to the governor, and we do kind of approach this. We don't want to inflict any unnecessary burden. There are several agencies that are doing the 15% submitted proposals, showing how they would get there. Again, that's often by holding vacant positions, continuing to hold them vacant, renegotiating contracts. A lot of agencies are actually using kind of the working from home to their advantage. And so whether that's taking another look at how their leases can be restructured for lower footprints for the fiscal year, or just lower travel reimbursement costs. There are several agencies that asked to do some target less than 15%, and we're working with those agencies. I would say, in general, I think we've followed up with every agency so far in terms of kind of getting some sort of back and forth discussion going on those strategic plans. And some of those are coming back in under 15%. But I think whenever we release when the revenue report comes out at the September Budget Committee meeting, I think by then we should have kind of all of this finished and fine-tuned in terms of what those reversion targets are going to look like for almost all state agencies.
That concludes today's briefing. Thank you for joining us.